2023 Philadelphia Eagles had one of the worst midseason collapses we've seen in NFL history. It sounds like an over-exaggeration, but they started 10-1 and they finished 11-6. They lost 5 of their last 6 games, and they're the first team in NFL history to not win 12 games despite starting 10-1. There were a lot of reasons why this team fell apart, and we're going to go through that today. But the main point of this video is, how did this team turn it around in the 2024 offseason? How was this team 11-2 the next year? Despite having the same coach, despite having a lot of the same roster, and despite having the biggest collapse possibly ever. This is Son of a Sports. Let's get into it. Let's start with Coach Nick Sirianni. There were a lot of questions about him going into the offseason. But the Philadelphia Eagles had one thing in mind. This guy coached us to a Super Bowl the previous year. We have to give him one more chance to prove himself. If he's not able to do this in 24, he's gone. The Eagles had to address his coaching staff around him, the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, and everything around that. Because, well, in 2023, the Eagles' assistant coaching staff with Sean Desai, Matt Patricia, and Brian Johnson were not good. They were not good coaches for this team, and there was no reason that they should be able to stay another year because both the offense and defense collapsed for this organization. But Sirianni was given one more chance. The organization and the front office understood Sirianni lost his assistant coaches to head coaching jobs in 23. Shane Steichen, the offensive coordinator from 2021 and 2022, Jonathan Gannon, the defensive coordinator from 2021 and 2022, both got head coaching jobs, and those were big holes to fill, as they were both extremely talented coaches that contributed an extreme amount to this Eagles team that made the Super Bowl. So, let's talk about what the Eagles did for this coaching staff. Former Miami Dolphins defense coordinator, former Broncos head coach, former Bears defensive coordinator, Vic Fangio, was, wanting to go home and be with his family in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. And Miami did not love him that year. They did not have the best relationship. His players did not like his tough coaching. The Dolphins just were fine with letting him go. And Fangio went, and the Eagles traded for him. The Eagles landed one of the best defensive play callers in the NFL that basically led his philosophy into the modern era. He is probably the first defensive coordinator that showed real promise in slowing down the Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan coaching tree schemes. And I mean that with Sean McVay was so impressed by the Bears shutting him down in 2018, him and his Rams that went on to go to the Super Bowl, that he hired Fangio's linebacker coach to be the defensive coordinator for his teams because he wanted at least somebody from his coaching tree to be involved. Fangio utilizes a lot of cover 2, cover 4, and cover 6 defenses that will split the field in half. I don't need to go into schematics of all of it, but you hear the term 2 high shell safety. That is Fangio's bread and butter. He is brilliant, and the Eagles desperately needed brilliant in the building. Kellen Moore was the offensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys from 2019 to 2022. Out of 2 of those 4 seasons, in 2019 and 2021, the Cowboys were the best offense in the NFL, the highest rated offense. And in 2022, they had one of the better offenses in the league, despite losing the quarterback for a few games, and then him coming back and not being his best self. Probably one of his worst seasons of his career. Kellen Moore went on to be the Chargers offensive coordinator in 2023, and that team was a disaster. I won't go into that much. But the Eagles saw him as a guy that was pretty much the only young guy left on the market that could show a progressive offense for this team, a more current NFL modern offense, an offense that uses motion and will best utilize running the football with passing the football. And he's worked with a lot of really good players, and Justin Herbert, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, Ezekiel Elliott when he was in his prime still, Tony Pollard. There were a lot of good players that offensive coordinator Kellen Mond worked with in his time in Dallas and the Chargers, even if the Chargers' time was 1 year and a disaster. So, the Eagles saw this as the opportunity to go get a guy that was young, could work with quarterbacks, have a good relationship with younger players, and also establish a modern offense. And they saw that in Kellen Moore. The last thing the Eagles needed to do in terms of their coaching staff was Sirianni himself. He had to address what went wrong in 23. And a lot of what went wrong with Sirianni in general was his relationship with Jalen Hurts. I'm not a drama guy. I'm not a guy that tries to comment too much on people's relationships because I'm not those people. I'm not in the building for the Eagles. I'm not a player for the Eagles. I'm not even a player in the NFL. So when I talk about this, I talk about from what I know as a member of the media, a content creator, and someone that has been in NFL news cycles for the last few years. 23 and then going into 24, there were a lot of questions in terms of Sirianni and Hurts' relationship. Even before the season in 24, there were articles coming out scaring Eagles fans and fans in general that Sirianni and Hurts were not at a point yet that they could be a quarterback and coach. So this was an issue that had to be addressed in the offseason, and they were going to have to make things work because there's no reason a culture coach and a quarterback should not have a good relationship. Defensive coordinator Vic Fangio, head coach Nick Sirianni, and GM Howie Roseman had their work cut out for him in terms of this roster. The defense, one of the worst in the NFL in 23, despite being one of the best in the NFL in 22. They were one of the worst passing defenses in the NFL, and there were so many questions in terms of pretty much every position except defensive tackle on this unit. Let's look at the 2023 Eagles defensive depth chart, and let's start with edge rusher. Brandon Graham and Josh Sweat, and Hassan Reddick, because they have him listed as Sam linebacker, but he was really the edge rusher there at the left spot. Hassan Reddick needed a contract, and it was unclear that the Eagles were going to give it to him. He was 29 years old, and yeah, I mean, they really did not need to allocate money to a 29-year-old edge rusher when they could probably find that somewhere else. Brandon Graham is a 36-year-old Eagles legend, but they were still going to need to have more depth at this defensive line. And Josh Sweat, a guy that requested a trade in the offseason, I'm pretty sure, he ended up staying, and he's been good for the Eagles in 2024, but they still needed help. Nolan Smith, a guy with a very good athletic profile in the draft, and a guy the Eagles took a chance on because, well, they keep drafting Georgia players, and Nolan Smith just had a lot of promise, and if they let him sit behind a lot of these starters and develop in his rookie year, he might be something. The defensive tackle spots, I'll talk about why they're okay here in a minute mostly, but Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter, that's all you got to say. 2 first-round picks. Jalen Carter was the highest-graded prospect in 2021, or in the 2022 draft for most of the year, and a character issue and an incident led to him falling a little bit, but he was still the guy. Milton Williams, a young, underrated piece that was waiting for his chance. Linebacker core, probably a bottom 5 in the league in 23. And it's not probably, it's for sure. Zach Cunningham, Nicholas Morrow, and Shaq Leonard were not good linebackers for this unit, and I don't think any of them are on the team anymore. I know they were banking on Nakobe Dean playing, and he doesn't show here, but Nakobe Dean was not ready yet, and I think he had some injury issues, and when he played, he just wasn't ready yet. The cornerback room, also not good. Darius Slay is an older corner, and he needed some help. Bradbury was not the help he needed. Bradbury did not replicate his 2022 performance, and he was one of the worst corners in the NFL in 23. Reed Blankenship, a second-year player that the Eagles liked a lot. I think a lot of people saw some promise in him. The issue was he just was out of position. Kevin Byard was who they traded for midseason, and as a Cowboys fan, I was very pissed when this happened. It did not really work for him. I'm pretty sure it helped him out in the Dolphins game, though, so shout out him for that. And then Avonte Maddox, I think he struggled with some injuries, and they retained him for the next year, so I'm not really going to comment on that much. I don't know a lot about Avonte Maddox as much as I do for the rest of this defense. And why I say the Eagles were fine at defensive tackle is, well, Fletcher Cox. He is an Eagles legend, NFL legend, and one of the best defensive tackles to play this game. Maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. Let's just say he was really, really freaking good. And it was a big loss, but the Eagles planned around him one day retiring. The Eagles actually, going into 2022, I think cut him and then re-signed him. So they were preparing for the day that he would, eventually retire. They were always going to keep him on the roster, and he was always going to be good. But when he called it quits, they had a plan with Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis, and Milton Williams, if you want to mention someone else in that room. Most of the Eagles' 2023 offensive struggles was due to scheme. They weren't as bad as they were defensively, but they definitely struggled towards the end of the year, and for a big part of the year, it just didn't make sense for a lot of their play calls, even if they got away with it. But they did lose somebody. NFL legend Jason Kelce, one of the best centers of all time, if not the best center of all time, and the glue guy for this team, honestly. He was incredible up until the very end. And it was clear the Eagles had a contingency plan there, just like they did with Fletcher Cox. They had Cam Jurgens. They drafted him in 2022 and had planned for when Kelce was going to retire, because he was already talking about it after 2021 and the struggles the Eagles had those few years with missing the playoffs in 2020 and 2021, barely making the playoffs and getting dominated the way they did. But Jurgens was going to be the guy. They drafted him in the second round in 2022, and it was clear they were going to put him at right guard, let him play there, and then grow him into being the center. He was never going to be Kelce. No one can really replicate what Kelce meant to that city, to the game for him, He was never going to be that level, but he could still be a very good quality NFL starting center. General manager Howie Roseman had a lot on his plate. He had to address corner, linebacker, safety in some capacity, edge rusher in some capacity, and then going on offense, I mean, running back DeAndre Swift was a free agent. You had to address right guard. You probably had to address receiver in terms of who's going to be the receiver outside of A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But, okay, let me just say, those are two really good receivers, but a team always needs a third receiver. Go watch a lot of the struggles that the Dolphins have had throughout this year. And then they were going to have to address just how this team goes forward, how this team is going to deal with Sirianni and Hurts' relationship issues, the collapse they had last year, and what this team was going to look like for the future, because you had so many guys locked down on contracts. You had a lot of young guys. How were they going to deal with this and move forward? If there was anybody in the league, though, that you could trust to probably handle this situation, it was going to be Howie Roseman. I'll start off with one of the most underrated signings of the offseason, Zach Bond. I really like this signing for the Eagles because they did have to address linebacker, and Zach Bond was one of the more underrated linebackers in the league. They were banking on Nakobe Dean developing, while also Zach Bond just being the guy coming in and being a good run stopper, while at least being a decent enough coverage linebacker that they didn't have to worry all the time about, some big game against Nicholas Morrow or Zach Cunningham. To address right guard, they signed former Jets right tackle Mekhi Becton. And Becton was very, very promising in his rookie year. Then he struggled with a lot of injuries. He struggled with weight issues. And the Jets eventually let him go. He did not have a very good 2023 whatsoever. But the Eagles had one of the best offensive line coaches in NFL history. And they knew that if they got him in their building, they could just let him grow and develop and put him at guard and see what he looks like there. Then the Eagles addressed safety. C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who had just spent a year with the Detroit Lions. He didn't play much. Pretty sure he played in the playoffs. Played like a few games in the regular season, and he got hurt for most of the year. They signed him back. He was from the 2022 championship team after they traded for him in the previous offseason before then. And I think he played nickel for him in that 2022 squad. I'm not sure. He might have played strong safety, but he was signed over to be the strong safety for this 2024 Eagles defense. And it was a good move, bringing him in, and a guy that's familiar with the building, familiar with the team, maybe not familiar with the scheme as much, but a guy that is a good energy piece, and that's desperately what you needed for this defense. And then they signed Bryce Huff. This is not a piece that has worked out as much, but I'm not going to fault Philly for going in on a piece that on paper should have worked better. He was a young player, a young defensive end for the New York Jets. He had a really good year in 23, as a lot of defensive players did on that D-line in 23 for the Jets. And he hasn't played well in 24 for Philly and is hurt right now and on IR, but that's a good signing in terms of on paper and when they signed him. A lot of people had a feeling that if the Eagles were going to make a move, it would be a move like this, getting a guy that could probably take that Hassan Reddick spot, because they sent Hassan Reddick in a trade to the New York Jets. It wasn't like Bryce Huff was sent over. They signed him and then traded Hassan Reddick back to the team they took Bryce Huff from. And it worked out in terms of Hassan Reddick has not played with the Jets much this year, and they still have a chance to see what Bryce Huff could end up being. I'm not going to fault Philly for how he's played in his first year on this contract. And then finally, the most impactful move of the offseason, Saquon Barkley. The Philadelphia Eagles signing Saquon Barkley shook the league, honestly. The Giants, there was no feeling that he would leave the Giants for Philly of all teams. Maybe another team, maybe even the Cowboys, but Philly just is the direct rival of the New York Giants. And honestly, it's worked out incredibly for him. If the quarterback position was not the dominant position for the MVP award, Saquon Barkley has this easily. He would be MVP of every position outside of quarterback. He'll win Offensive Player of the Year. He is on pace right now to break the all-time rushing record in 17 games, but still on pace to do so. Saquon Barkley has been incredible for this Philadelphia Eagles team, and he's been healthy all year behind an elite offensive line that has allowed him to just be Saquon. And being Saquon is being a top 5, top 3 running back in the National Football League. After signing in free agency and making some splashy moves and some underrated moves, the Eagles moved towards the draft, and their first 2 picks were 2 cornerbacks, and Kenyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. Kenyon Mitchell was more underrated early in the process. He went to a smaller school at Toledo. He was a true senior, and he really showed out at the Senior Bowl, and that's when he started climbing to the first round. Cooper DeJean was pretty high up most of the process. But he started falling later in the process because of injury he had to his foot, I believe. And people kept questioning, could he play tackle or corner at the NFL level? And was he going to have to move to safety? Both of these guys have been great for the Eagles. I don't think DeJean played as much early in the year, but has played a lot now at their nickel spot more often. And then Kenyon Mitchell's been there, straight up lockdown corner. He's been incredible. I know Eagles fans are going to throw out the Darrelle Revis comparison, but I don't think it's there. I think he's still going to be one of the best corners in the NFL for years to come. He's just all the traits that people have loved, all the reasons they fell in love with him in the Senior Bowl, they have shown to work out. And then after that, it's about maximizing on the talent that the Eagles already have waiting. Nakobe Dean was a guy that slipped in the draft because of injury concerns, and I think it was a shoulder injury or something like that. And a lot of teams didn't want to take that risk. I don't even think he got treated for it properly. And he's been waiting for a few years, but now he's had his opportunity. Jordan Davis, a guy that they selected in the first round in 2021 to be this guy that can be the nose tackle of the future. And he had some, conditioning concerns, and how good was he really going to be? He's extremely athletic, but the conditioning's not good, and the consistency at Georgia wasn't really there. Well, he's showing now that was worth the first round pick because he's been their guy a lot of this year. Earlier in the year, he'll admit himself he had some things to work on, and the Eagles' rushing defense was not that great to begin the year. But since then, they've just gotten better and better and better, and a lot of that is Jordan. Jordan blocking the middle up, taking a lot of the double teams, so the linebackers, Nakobe Dean and Zach Bond, can capitalize on what he has made for them. And I think that, and a guy like Reed Blankenship that has switched to free safety and been able to just play in his spot, cooking with his game and developing, it's worked for this team. Their defense is so much better than last year and probably their Super Bowl year, honestly. And this video feels like a recap of what the Eagles have done and okay, well, we know about Saquon. We know about some of the signings they've done. We know what they did in the draft. Kenyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, you see it everywhere. What I'm trying to do is highlight what they did. And this is a team that lost the Super Bowl, went in the next year, and like I said, started 10-1, finished 11-6, had one of the biggest midseason collapses we've ever seen. And then the next year, they were 11-2, and maybe a collapse could happen again. It's 2 more games played than before. But this team feels like they're finally turning up at the right moment. You want to see a little bit more out of their passing game because, well, the passing game has not been great. Hurts has not been perfect or great by any means, especially to his standards. But Saquon makes things easier. The defense, they are the best defense in the NFL right now. And the rushing defense is finally really good, and the passing defense is incredible. They were the second worst passing defense in the NFL last year, and now they feel like the best. Vic Fangio has his guys out there, and they're playing to his game at a high level, at an elite level. And I probably have them over the Lions in the NFC right now, simply because the injuries that the Lions have suffered and that the injuries that the Eagles have suffered earlier in the year, well, those guys are coming back for the Eagles, and the Lions are still having to hold out hope that these guys on their defense can come back. They have lost so much in terms of injuries. But yeah, I think the Eagles deserve a lot of acknowledgement and praise for the work that they have done over the last calendar year. At the beginning of this calendar year, the Eagles finished a season where it was a disaster, and there was very little hope in terms of turning around a Nick Sirianni era in Philadelphia. But right now it feels like, okay, sky's the limit for this team. They might be the favorite in the NFC, and they feel like the most talented roster in the NFL. Let's see what the Eagles can do. And this is Son of a Sports. I'll catch y'all next time.